So thank you all for being here for our June Chaos member meeting. We have a really great agenda today, and we have speakers that are joining us to help us learn more about house and structure relocation. Just a reminder that probably no one needs at this point, please do feel free to utilize the chat function that's located at the bottom of your screen for Zoom. You can use it to communicate with one another in any way you'd like to. We encourage you to ask questions to our speakers, either in the chat or by video if you would like. We do have some Q&A sessions that are set aside today, so if you want to ask questions during that time, that would probably be best. If you'd like to come off video to ask a question, you can click the reactions button and raise your hand, and we'll be sure to call on you, or you can just speak up and say, I want to ask a question. We ask that especially during the presentations, you keep your microphones and videos off, because this helps us control bandwidth. We also will be using today a very handy audience participation tool that I've never really used before. It's called Mentimeter. And so we're going to give you a chance to kind of participate today live. And I'll explain how that's going to work here a little bit more in a few minutes. First, I'll go over today's agenda, though. We'll begin with a quick and exciting announcement, chaos-related announcement, and we'll do some audience polling kind of right off the bat, like I said, with Mentimeter, and I'll explain how that works. Then we'll hear from Dave Mickelson on the geology and bluff erosion processes of Lake Superior, and that will be followed by a Q&A with Dave. So if you have any questions with Dave, we do have a Q&A set aside. Then we'll hear from Jane Bucy on the experience of relocating her former home away from eroding bluff. And after Jane presents, we'll have one more audience polling session. After the audience polling, we'll hear from Tammie DeVooght Blaney about the benefits and the processes of house and structure relocation. After Tammie speaks, we'll have a joint Q&A with both Jane and Tammie, and then we'll end today's meeting with a little bit more audience polling. So like I said, I have a quick announcement that I want to make to you all as Chaos members. We have some really exciting events in the works for this summer that you'll have the opportunity to sign up for and attend soon. So we've been in the process of planning some Chaos field trip opportunities where Chaos members can visit a site in person. As of now, we have 2 field trips planned. One is in Minnesota and one is in Wisconsin. On the Minnesota side, we're going to be visiting Brighton Beach, where the city of Duluth is going to be beginning a project of relocating a road away from the shoreline. And we're hoping to be joined by some city planners where they can show us the site, plans for the project, etc. We do have a date set for that field trip already. We're aiming to visit Brighton Beach on August 18th, and the field trip will be at 10 a.m. So feel free to mark your calendars for this if you're interested, but we will be sending out a formal save the date and registration soon. We're also really excited to be planning a field trip on the Wisconsin side to a home that was relocated away from an eroding bluff. And this is actually the same home that you're going to be hearing about today during our meeting from Jane Bucy. The current owners of that home, Dan and Mary, who I believe are joining us on the call today, just to be a member of the audience. They have actually given us permission to visit their property, and we're so appreciative of that. We hope to be joined at that field trip by some experts speaking about the soil structure and geology of the area, among other topics. So we don't have a date set for that field trip yet, but it will also be in August, and you'll be receiving a save the date and registration invite soon. So if these field trip opportunities sound interesting to you, make sure to be on the lookout for that invite. I'll send it by email here in the next week or so, and we'll likely only be taking 25 registrants per field trip. So if you're interested, please make sure that you don't wait to register when you get that in your inbox. Okay, so this leads us to kind of an activity we're going to be folding into the meeting today. We're going to be using a tool called Mentimeter to give you all a chance to participate and share your thoughts on today's topic of house and structure relocation. So In order to do this, you can use either a smartphone if you have one of those, or if you are on a browser or you can open a browser, you can also use that. So what you're going to do if you'd like to participate is open your smartphone browser or a browser on your computer that you're using, and you can type in www.menti.com. And then once you do that, you'll be prompted to type in this 8-digit code that you see on your screen here. And we'll make sure that that's also in the chat. If you're smartphone savvy, you can also scan this QR code you see on the screen. But some people don't even know what that QR code is. So feel free to just type in the website and type in the code. So I'll give folks a few moments to try to figure that out. And if you're having any issues, feel free to type in the chat that you're having problems, and we'll try to help you.
Sarah, I will say that my iPhone's not liking that QR code very well. It's trying to open it and having a little trouble. So if you're trying to open it and having trouble, maybe just go to the website directly and try entering the code from there. But it might just be my connection here too.
And once you do log on your phone or on your browser, you should see a mostly blank screen that just says instructions. And I think there will be a little heart there that you can actually press and react to just show that you're connected to the presentation. You don't have to do that, but it is an option. Is that what it looks like to you, Kate? Does the screen just look like a blank screen with instructions?
Yep. And there's a little green heart. Yes. So
okay.
If you click on that, that should let us know you're in there. But again, not that totally needed. And yeah, it looks like it's working now for my QR code too. So I'm on there.
Okay,
too.
Great. Yeah, we're trying this Mentimeter tool out for the first time. So this is a new learning process for us as it is for you guys, but it looks like a lot of you are having success. I'm seeing your heart reactions down in the corner. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. I believe at the top of my screen, you should be able to see the code and the website on any of the slides. So you should be able to log on at any time. And again, if you have any questions about logging on Menti, you can type it in the chat and we'll make sure to help you get logged on to there. But we're really excited that you guys are going to be able to talk to us today. So my first question for you all to participate in through Mentimeter, so on your smartphones or in your browser, is this one here. So we recognize that relocation, this topic of relocation, can refer to different things depending on who you're talking to. It can refer to relocation at kind of the community level, which is something that you often see on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. But today we're mostly focused on relocation in the context of private landowners moving structures or moving homes away from eroding bluff or shoreline. And we're talking about relocation in the context of the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Superior and the Wisconsin and Minnesota coastline of Lake Superior. So I want to know, what questions do you have about structure relocation? This can be as broad as I don't know what it is. It can be as specific as something else you might be familiar with. So go ahead and type in any questions that you have about structure relocation into Mentimeter. Okay. I'm seeing 3 of you have participated, and I'm seeing, how do I find a structure mover to work with? What are the costs, both for moving of a structure and the associated costs like plumbing, reconnecting electricity, etc.? Those are great questions. How many permits will I need? How can we make structure relocation accessible / equitable for lower income households? These are really good questions. I'm hoping that some of our speakers today can either address these questions in just their presentations, or we may have to revisit some of these questions so they can answer them specifically. I'm also seeing, will non-conforming structures be regulated, as in, will they have to be relocated back / can't do improvements / riprap is not a viable option to protect a non-conforming structure? That is a very well thought out question. How much space do I need? These are some really good questions. And when I scroll down, you guys are seeing when I scroll down, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How long do residents typically have to be out of their home? How does an LUG ask/suggest the best action? Structure relocation to a property owner. Main common issues. I am really liking seeing all of these very well thought out questions. Hopefully our speakers can see these questions, and if they have a way to address them already in their presentation, that's great, but I'm happy to come back to this later when it comes time to have our Q&As, so that we can make sure these questions get addressed. I think they're all very good questions, and thank you for playing along. We will have some more of these questions throughout the presentation, and I'll do one more quickly before we go. So some people have described the moving of structures away from the coast using the term managed retreat, and sometimes folks think this term is more relevant when we're talking about larger scale relocation that I mentioned, or the moving of entire communities away from a coastline. So we want to know, do you have thoughts about using this term managed retreat? Is this a term that's relevant to the Great Lakes region? Is this a larger issue than what's experienced in this region? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Are you familiar with this term managed retreat? Just what are your thoughts? How do you feel about it? Okay. Retreat implies defeat and has a negative connotation. Okay, I have to think too long about what it means. Okay. Okay, so far I'm seeing some mixed opinions. Very interesting. Okay, implies the government is involved. We need a different term. Very interesting. I'll give you a minute more if you have anything else to say. Could refer to retreat of the bluff top. Okay. I think it sounds like a military maneuver. Valuable strategy, but loaded term. Okay. Well, thank you all for participating. Like I said, this won't be our last question, but these are really interesting responses. And if speakers have something they want to say about it, that's fine. If not, we can come back during the Q&A. Often people do not understand that to save the shoreline they need to move. Okay, I'm really liking this Mentimeter tool. I'm really liking seeing you guys participating this way. All right, well, it's 10:15, so I am gonna go ahead and switch gears for a minute, and we're gonna hear from Dave Mickelson. So Dave Mickelson is a professor emeritus from the UW-Madison Department of Geoscience, and he's going to be talking to us today about the local geology and bluff erosion processes affecting Wisconsin's shoreline of Lake Superior. So I'm gonna go ahead and switch gears over to Dave, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for now. We'll come back to Mentimeter later. Okay, Kate, are you sharing screen?
I think Dave got it to run before, so let's give him a chance to see if he can do it. Otherwise, I'm
Is that working?
Not yet, Dave.
Gee, it worked a few minutes ago.
Of course it did.
We'll get it figured out. It's okay.
Yeah. It looks like it's going. There we
go. All right, take it away, Dave. Thank you so much.
All right, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the erosion that's taking place along the Lake Superior shoreline. Part of the Lake Superior shoreline is bedrock, and for the most part, the recession isn't a problem, except in a few places. So most of what you're going to see is a recession of bluff shoreline, either with sand and gravel in the bluff or glacial till, which is typically clay, or a combination of both. And so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, and then if you have questions later, I'll be happy to do what I can to answer them. All right, let's see what happens here. All right, a lot of agencies have been involved in the shoreline erosion projects. I've been doing this since the mid-1970s. And so we've accumulated a lot of information. In particular, we have oblique air photographs taken along the shoreline in a number of different years. For example, what you're seeing here is 2019, part of the 2019 array of photographs and part of the Lake Superior shoreline. And the numbers on the side here show how many photos. So Douglas County has 618, Bayfield over 2,000, and so on. Those are all online and accessible. And if you, I think, Google Wisconsin shoreline inventory and oblique photo viewer, that's what the site is called. I think that will come up, and you can have a choice of looking at a variety of different years. I also want to quickly mention a study that we did in 2019 that concentrated on the Lake Superior shoreline. These are the photo years that are available, by the way. I got a little ahead of myself there. But these colors here are an evaluation that I did in 2019 and earlier in about 2008, I think it was, on those photos. And so we have a broad generalization of what was happening along the shoreline in 2008. And then you'll see the same thing taking place, being done for the 2019 photos. One thing that's striking is that a lot of more red here than there was in 2008. And that's mostly, I think, because of the higher lake level initiating more bluff failure. And again, these numbers are all in a report that I think Kate can provide, I hope, if somebody wants it. Mine's on a hard drive that doesn't work anymore, so I don't think I can find a copy. But anyway, what we did is also summarized in 2008 and 2019, basically how much was unstable and failing. And you can see in the total miles, 61 miles were unstable and failing. And then in 2019, moderately stable. And that number of moderately stable bluffs had dropped by about half. So water level, lake level does make a difference. And that is a pretty good indicator of it. And one of the reactions to this higher lake level is the addition of shoreline structures, things that armor the shoreline. This can be riprap, just loose riprap, or it could be an actual breakwater, or a variety of things. So in the 4 counties, we can just look at the total down here. Very little is armored in Douglas County, as you might expect. Most of that is just right around Superior. In Bayfield, a little bit more, very little in Iron County, but Ashland County is almost 20% protected shoreline. Almost all of that is on Madeline Island. So there's a lot of protection that's been put in at that time. And looking at the 2022 photographs that were just taken about a month ago, there are even more structures being constructed or have been constructed recently. So definitely people are putting money into shore protection as a way to try to solve that high lake level problem. To give you an idea of what lake levels have been, 2000 is over here. I'm sorry, you can't can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so 2000 is here and present is out over here at 2022. We had low lake levels here until about 2014. And then lake level rose above the mean, which is the red line here, and then fluctuated above the mean up until very late in the last year when it's dropped down, but it's expected to come back up above average level again. So what we want to do is look at the photographs that were taken here after a fairly long low water period. And then we're going to look at a number of 2019 photos and some 2022 photos that record what's happening with high water. Oops, sorry. So many of these are on Madeline Island, not all, but quite a few are. This one is. And so 2008, lake level had been low for a long time. The wide beach, the bluff looks fairly stable, a few bare spots. 2012, maybe even a little more stable, certainly not failing in any way because the water continued to be low. Then we jumped from 2012, which is the top photo. You saw that in the last slide, but now we add 2017. So now lake level is higher. And look what's happening at the bottom of the bluff. Bottom of the bluff is being eaten away. Shallow. This is shallow sliding on clay. This is clay till, and things are just starting to slide. And then if we go 2017, this is the picture on top is the one you just saw, and now 2019, 2 more years later, look how much has failed. Now this whole bluff from top to bottom is sliding. And even is separated up here at the top of the bluff, which was connected at this time. And then we keep going. So 2019, lots of stuff coming down because of that high lake level, narrow beach. And by 2022, they've put in some shore protection, some riprap at the bottom, and the lake level has now been down for a short time, but the bluff is already starting to stabilize because there's no more wave cutting or very little wave cutting at the bottom. So it's that wave cutting that initiated that failure. And when you stop the wave cutting, it does tend to stabilize the bluff relatively quickly. Just one in Iron County. Now, this is the kind of thing that takes a long time to react, both to high level and lake level. So 2008, it was already failing. By 2019, it was failing even more. High water level is eating away, the waves are eating away the debris that's coming down the slope. So this got really active by 2019. And there's the 2019 picture repeated on top, but now it's the 2022, only a month ago, and the lake level is somewhat lower. And the debris that has come down in the past is now being eaten away slowly by high water. I didn't point it out, but these arrows are pointing to the same place on the slide. So that's a bluff that if you had a house up here, it would be very, very difficult to stabilize. By far, the best decision would be to move the house. All right, some other examples. This one's back on Madeline Island, 2012. By 2019, you can see almost all the vegetation is gone, although these trees are still hanging on. This one, is this one, this one, is this one. But all the surface is sliding off. 2019, which you just saw, and then 2022, a month ago, you can see that the trees are still hanging on. And maybe there's a little stabilizing, but it's stabilizing because material is sliding off the bluff edge here and just accumulating on the bluff face. This jumps over to Douglas County. And here you see this building. I guess that gets cut off, sorry. But anyway, that building is right here. I can't see it on my screen. But anyway, here it is in 2019. You can see the bottom of the slope here has really gotten destabilized by that high lake level. And this stuff is moving down. This tree is this tree. Make sure you see where you are here. But a substantial change from 2012 to 2019. And then another one in Douglas County. This is 2008. And then 2019, this is a big slump block down here at the base. And what happened is that high lake level allowed the waves to cut away at the base of the slump block. And typically what this does is remove the soil material that's holding the slump block back. So eventually this will probably fail way up here and this whole piece will come down. But I don't know when that will happen. So those are clay bluffs. Now we look at one that's actually a little bit of clay till on top of sand and gravel. This is in Bayfield County. Here you can see in 2012, the slope, I'll point out the buildings here. So again, that building is that building. This stairway is this stairway, and looks reasonably stable. And yet 7 years later, with higher water, the bluff is failing. And the waves eat away this material at the bottom that's protecting the base of the bluff. Because it's sand and gravel, that's just easily taken away by waves. It's not cohesive like clay, so it can be taken away in just a couple of storms. And you can see what's happened. It's now failing all the way to the bluff top in that a few years of high water. And then 2019, which is the one you saw before, and jumping to 2022, more of it's come down. Now the whole lower middle part of the bluff is failing, but because water level, lake level has been down for a couple of years, the stuff that's coming down is accumulating at the base. So it's just so clear that lake level has a big impact on what's happening, even on high bluffs. This staircase is still there. You just can't see it in the bushes, but I think there's a picture of the staircase itself. So this part of the bluff didn't fail. And of course, the homeowner's presumably glad of that. All right, another case. Out on Bark Point, this house was actually moved. The house in 2008 was getting pretty close to the top of the bluff. This is a thin till over sand and gravel, and it was getting close to the top of the bluff. So this house was moved from here back toward the road. This building is this building. So you see the house is now somewhat behind that building, or at least back even where this building is, whereas before it was closer to the edge of the bluff than that site, that storage building. And then this is the same place, 2012. Again, the bluff, base of the bluffs looks fairly stable. Here's the house has been moved back. It was moved back in, well, I think it was about 2010. It was after 2008, but before 2012. 2019, you see the base of the bluff is now being cleaned off by that high water. This material down here has been removed by wave erosion, and we're seeing the sand and gravel that makes up the material in the bluff, the in-place material, starting to be exposed. And then we jump to 2022. 2022 slide is now on top. I couldn't make it move once it got there, so. But anyway, you can see that this is the same two buildings as these two. And in 2019, the base of the bluff was being eroded, but the top was still vegetated. By 2022, by the last month, this is now bare all the way to the top. And you can see, obviously, this little shed here is getting very close to the edge and probably will go. So it's a good thing this house was moved, because that gives it a few more years, at least, of life before the top of the bluff works its way back that far. Here's one on Madeline Island. You can see a small house, cabin or something. Again, 2008, had low water, pretty stable. By 2019, water level had come up, been up for a few years, and starting to have some problems with erosion along here. And this is getting pretty close to the edge now. And here in that's the 2019 that you saw in the last slide. And now here's 2022. Here's that same building. Okay, that building is this building. Take my word for it, but you can see the chimney here is that chimney with the white patch around on the roof. Just bottom of the chimney is right there, and the windows match up. So that's the same place, and they haven't done anything with this, which is now very close to the edge of the bluff, except put some riprap along the bottom, and they put up a new house, which I don't know what this distance is, but it's pretty close. And obviously this bluff is moving back pretty quickly. So that's a place where unfortunately there's no option to move it because the highway is there, unless they happen to own the land across the street, and they're kind of stuck. Another one on Madeline Island, 2008. You can see the bluff here is pretty vegetated and a fairly wide beach. Here's this little jetty or breakwater that's here. That's the same one as this one. And by 2019, a few years of high water, and all that bluff vegetation is cleaned off and gone. And so then we move to 2022 down at the bottom here, and they've regraded. So this, again, this stairway is that stairway. There's this little jetty or breakwater, here it is here. And they've evidently have not done anything to the highway, but what they've done is basically regraded the slope. So this is new riprap that was put in, and they've put in fill, obviously, to grade this off and to attempt to stabilize it, and they've vegetated it. Now, there is riprap along here, but leaving this exposed with no riprap, because presumably that's a different property owner, is probably unwise, because what's going to happen is this is going to erode, and this won't erode. And so unless the highway department comes in and does the same thing here, or the owner does of this property, that's going to become a problem, because the highway is going to be threatened. And just up the street from it, if I can just go back. Okay, so here's this little breakwater here. And in the next slide, in 2022, here's that same breakwater, and they put up a new motel, apparently motel, because there's a parking lot there. And obviously that's a recently failing bluff. They put in some riprap at the bottom, but that's really close to the edge. And again, there's no option to move it because the road is there. So that, in my mind, was not a good decision. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation, and I guess I'll stop sharing. And let's see, stop share. Okay, so you want to wait for questions, or
yeah,
how will we do it, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Well, let's go ahead and take some questions. If folks have any questions, if you'd like to ask anything, you can feel free to raise your hand, and we can let you unmute and come on and ask your question on video. Or if you want to utilize the chat, that would also be fine. If you want to ask one of your questions that you typed into Mentimeter, that would be fine as well. But let's give Dave an opportunity to answer some questions. Go ahead, Miles.
Cool. Thank you. I always have to figure out how to raise my hand on the Zoom call. I'm slow. Dave, thank you. This was a really exciting look. Well, I guess maybe I should choose my language a little bit more carefully. It's terrifying and exciting for what you see. I'm sure if you live on the shoreline, you see this happen all the time. The first question I wanted to ask, because I haven't looked at Lake Superior as much, and as you were showing things around Madeline Island, I was starting to wonder if Madeline Island is showing more erosion or recession than the mainland. And so those pictures you showed us, could you tell me if they're concentrated at more of like the exposed face of the island to the lake, or is it all around the whole shebang, if that makes sense?
Well, it's, yeah, I guess I don't have any numbers, but I would say it's certainly the north facing and east facing parts of the island that show the most effective wave erosion. There's still some on the south side too. The southwest side is probably the only part of the island where there's an accumulation of sand along the shoreline. But I think the thing is, there's a lot of people living there. The density of development there is far greater than most any other place in Ashland County or Douglas County or Bayfield County for that matter.
Yeah, no, certainly. And then I start to wonder if that increase in development and density also leads to more failures along the shoreline.
Well, I don't think it influences how many failures are taking place, but it certainly influences the number of structures that are being threatened or will be threatened. And again, the response to that, and maybe Adam can speak to this, is that people are putting in wave protection structures. So that may well affect the neighbor and so on. So it just complicates the whole erosion process. It may protect a single property, but it's got to be done right so it doesn't have negative effects on adjacent properties.
Right. No, and I think folks are starting to know that, and it's what alternatives are out there to what you currently can do. No, again, thank you very much. This was very informative.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Good.
Can either of you or anyone tell me the current setback requirements for building today on high bluff erosion?
I can't.
Okay. I was just wondering, because of that hotel that was put into place fairly recently.
Yes, I know it.
I'm surprised that that was allowed. Is that Ashland County's responsibility or Bayfield's?
Ashland County.
Okay. Yeah, that one's a surprise. I mean, there's just no depth to that lot.
I know it.
So the minimum allowed by state regulations would be 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark, unless there's another sort of ordinance at the county or municipal level off of, say, an eroding bluff toe or bluff top. But I'm not sure entirely up to date on what the regulatory landscape is on all those counties up there. So couldn't be closer than 75 feet.
Well, one problem with that is the 75 feet includes the slope of the bluff. So that's from the ordinary high water mark, which is going to be at the base of the bluff. So it could be that half of that 75 feet is actually the bluff face.
Right. I'm just wondering if there's some verbiage on setback from the top of the bluff.
Well, a few years ago, Bayfield County was trying to do exactly that. And there's been so many personnel changes there now, I honestly don't know what enforcement there is or who is doing what. As you remember, Jane, when I was working up there, they were very active in trying to produce reasonable setbacks and so on. Right. But I don't know if that's happening now.
Yeah, I've lost touch with all that. I'm just curious. Thank you.
I just want to call attention to a question in the chat, which was, is the weight of septic systems on these bluffs a concern?
It certainly is. If the drain field is anywhere near the bluff top, that creates even more problems. It's not just the weight, it's the saturation. It's the addition of water on the top.
Go ahead, Jane.
A lot of those properties along the lakeshore don't have drain fields. They have holding tanks, which would not affect the water runoff.
Right. As long as they don't leak and get pumped regularly.
Exactly. Well,
yeah.
Joanna, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. I'm wondering if the state has any regulations on using riprap versus more natural stabilization. I know I'm listening from New York State, and our state regulators are pushing us to use natural shoreline techniques on the edge of Lake Erie, but trees aren't enough is what we're seeing. So I'm wondering if the state regulations have played a role at all.
Sarah Zape, I'm a water management specialist for this state. I can help answer that question. Our regulations for riprap have been pretty strict, so much so that for a large amount of the shoreline, it's exempt, meaning that we don't get notified that the project's going in, and they follow a checklist and pretty much self-approve themselves. So it's really hard to get a good calibration on talking to all the landowners to, teach them about why natural methods are better. And for the ones that we do see, we really don't have a good teeth to deter people from placing riprap instead of doing a natural solution. So people like Adam Beckley with UW Grant are really important with all their outreach events to educate people. So in all Wisconsin, we don't have a lot of teeth. We have a lot of exemptions, and that's probably our biggest hurdle.
Sarah, were those put in just because of the high water a few years ago?
No, the riprap exemption predates the recent high water.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Thank you for all of these questions. I see I have two other people with their hands raised, but I do want to be respectful of our speakers' time. So if you could just kind of make note that you have this question and maybe bring it up during Tammie and Jane's Q&A, and then Dave can pop in if it's irrelevant to him. Or you can feel free to type it in the chat and we can try to start a conversation there. But I want to be respectful of our time for our speakers. So I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Jane Bucy's talk. Jane Bucy is the former president of Bayfield County Economic Development Corporation and former chair of the Town of Clover. Jane also owned a home on the shoreline of Lake Superior, and she's going to share her experience in house moving as a response to an actively eroding bluff. So with that, Jane, please take it away. We're excited to hear from you.
Oh, thank you. You're in charge of the slideshow.
Yep.
Okay. So you can see the dot where we're located, and I think Dave told us years ago we were one of the highest points in Bayfield County on the lake shore. The first thing you need to do when you're getting ready to move a house is you have to find a good mover. And we were fortunate enough to do that. And the way we found it was about 20 years ago, I think we did this. I went online and entered house movers in the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I received about 5 phone calls. And I believe the very first one I received was the one we ended up with. It was just too good to be true. So I just kept looking. And they came from Clara City, Minnesota, and also participated in the Cape Hatteras move. Some of their equipment was used out there on the East Coast when the mega movers were doing that. So we found the house mover, and then your next big step is to find your excavating team and your carpenters and anybody else. And we were fortunate to put all that together with great people, and they all met with the house movers to find out exactly what was going to be expected of them and what the timeline was, and and what the procedures were. We were also very lucky that one of the excavators was very familiar with Bayfield County zoning, and he processed every ounce of paperwork for me. Doing that, we were still living in St. Louis at the time, so managing this job from 750 miles away was a little difficult. They really helped on that process of it. So one of the questions that was asked earlier was during the process of putting this meeting together was, would it have been less expensive to tear this house down or to move it? And so what you're looking at right now is the core of the house. We moved that, and That was a $60,000 cost just for the movers. I don't think you could have rebuilt that for $60,000. And so we chose to do the move. We tore off one room on the lake side of the house because it was this room that you stepped down into and made it much more difficult to move, and they would have had to punch holes through the walls and run the beams through the house. And so we just tore it off, and it was slated for remodeling anyway. And the distance that we were talking about moving this house back from the bluff was 150 feet. One of the things the movers told me was that the minimum amount of requirement that they were going to need to move this house was 30 feet. And I think we had about 50 feet left, so it was time. It originally sat on a crawl space, so when we moved this house, we moved it into a foundation for a basement. You can see how they, in this particular picture, how they build the foundation from the footings on up to the base of the house, and how the house is sitting on beams and all the cribbing that took place to hold this building in place. And the screw jacks are put into the cribbing in order to brace the beams when they want to drop it back down into place. And so this is an extensive process, but it took them basically not even 24 hours to get this house off of the foundation and up on blocks in the air, ready for move. I was amazed at how fast this went. You want to go to the next slide, I think. This is the finished product. You can see, we're on a new basement and the grading has been done. And once the grading was done, the landscapers decided that one of the ways to help this bluff erosion was to prevent the water from going over the edge. So on the north side of the house, it is all sloped to run east and west to a stable ravine on the west side. And then we put in garden beds out in the center of that lawn so that when the water came out of the woods, it bumped into those garden beds and moved it around, slowed it down, and landed into a rain garden. We put it on the far west side of the house. And then that all went down to the stable ravine. And it worked. I'm assuming it's still working, Dan, is it? Dan is our
Yes.
current homeowner of that place.
Yes, it is still working.
Okay. Anyway, that's a quick turnover of, you can see that this is the house after it's been done, and you can see how the lawn slopes there. All of that slope goes into the rain garden and prevents it from getting into the house and going down into the lawn that is at a lower level for the walkout. And the other thing, obviously, that helps your water control is your mowing. And you don't want to mow clear to the very edge. You want that water to wiggle its way through grass and through trees and anything else you can do to slow it down. So that's a very brief synopsis of moving this house and the process that it takes. You can see that the ravines that we were fighting. This house was originally, like as I said, very close to the bluff, and the previous owners that we bought it from had filled the bluff. And you can see where they got all the water from to the ravine to the left over there, and they put it in front of the house. And then that huge ravine on the left was started because of that excavation. I don't have any more comments. If somebody else wants to ask some questions, I know there were a lot of questions that I saw that were pertinent.
Yes, and Jane, we do actually have a Q&A, joint Q&A with you and Tammie set aside.
Okay.
But if folks do have questions they're afraid they might forget or something and they want to ask them right now, that would be
Sure.
acceptable too. We do have a little bit of wiggle room and time. So
Okay.
if folks
I
have
can't
questions
see.
for Jane.
Yeah, I can't see any questions on the screen, so we were really fortunate to find the movers that we did. They were just not only excellent movers, but just really nice people. And I think they were like 4th generation house movers. If you go backwards on those slides a little bit, I'll explain what they're doing to the house when it's when the top. Okay. That you look at there, you can see a series of chains going through and hooking up with the dollies. And what they're doing there is getting ready to actually move the house down the slope into the basement area. And the next slide, Sarah, there, that one you can see where they're cranking, and this is actually turning the house in order to angle it at the, so whatever angle you want it to be facing the lake shore. And those dollies travel down the wooden planks that you see there. I don't know if you can see that little black dot at the end of the wooden planks. That's where the dollies land, and they're finished moving the house.
Sarah, if there's time, Clinton Little has his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, Clint, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks for sharing your story. I was wondering, it looks like you have a really nice deep lot here, and I was wondering what kind of factors went into your decision on how far back to set the house. Were slope and other things considered?
I think it was discussion standing out in front of the house with the whole team on how far back it should go. There wasn't a lot of science to it, and obviously the more you went back, the higher it went. And so it improved your view, and we didn't want to go too far back. So the 150 feet was what we chose. And I think as it turned out with Mickelson's formulas that he was working with, we were pretty close to what was the suggested setback if it was available in this type of position.
Yeah, that's right. It was just a little landward of our safety line.
Right. I think our deck overextended the 150 feet, but the house itself was 150 feet. And we hadn't lost a lot of frontage by the time we sold, and that was 4 years ago. So this is like 16 years of watching the erosion. There is riprap on the base of that bluff that was put in over 30 years ago, and I think it was there in place up until a couple of years ago when we had those major storms come through. And again, Dan, you'll have to speak to that.
Yeah, in 2019, the fall of 2019, there was some big storms that took some of the didn't move the riprap, but it moved some soil and took away some of the facing, especially at the bottom of the stairs.
Right. And this is on a fairly protected cove. Any other questions?
Thank you for sharing all that, Tammie. And like I said, this is not the last chance at all to ask Jane. Sorry, Jane. I called you Tammie. This is not the last chance to ask Jane questions. We do have a Q&A after Tammie presents where you can ask both of them any questions that you have. We do have another Mentimeter question, but I'm not going to go ahead and pop it on the screen just so that we give Tammie plenty of time to talk. And I can tell that the Q&A is going to be fruitful. So if you are logged on to Mentimeter and you want to respond to that question, it's how receptive do you think individuals are to structure relocation as a tool? And I can come back and show that at the end if we have time, but I don't want to pause right now. I want to give Tammie plenty of time. So if you want to respond to that question, feel free, but I'm not going to pop it up on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Tammie. So Tammie is the executive director of the International Association of Structure Movers. Sorry, my screen just went away. International Association of Structure Movers, and is the editor of Structural Mover magazine. In her role at IASM, she manages their membership, plans an annual conference for structural movers, arranges advocacy events with elected officials and other stakeholders, and promotes the industry at local, regional, and national and international events. Tammie has a bachelor's degree in psychology from UW-Oshkosh and a master's degree from Lakeland University. Thank you so much for being here, Tammie, and go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I had some fun picking out pictures for my presentation, and I just picked out some old ones. And I guess the one thing that I like to say is certainly building moving, structure moving has been around forever and ever and ever. And it's basically the same process. Jane did a great job explaining the process with her pictures that she showed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, not so much. I would say that my presentation is kind of a broad overview about building moving. So the next slide, you can just, you can skip onto the one after that. That was just me explaining who I am. I'm the executive director of this association. That's a trade association basically made up completely of structural movers or people that are manufacturing equipment for structural movers in the industry around the world. I would say 70% of our members are from the US, and then we have about 15% from Canada and then 5% from different countries outside of that. My main role is working with our members, and then the second part of what I do is working with the public and helping connect them with a structural mover. Jane brought that up as well. How do you find someone? She Googled it, and that's usually what people do, and often their Google search leads them to me. And we have a website that I have shared on this presentation to let you know how to reach movers through there. So this trade association has been around for a long time, since the 80s. When, just like any other industry, movers realized they don't have a lot of connections with people like maybe in their local areas. And so they banded together, met in Atlanta, people from several countries, I think 12 countries at that time, and decided to start the association. We typically have about 300 members, and I told you the makeup of where they come from. The main purpose of our association is to help our members with finding work, with getting education, and with connecting to vendors and people like insurance agents and things like that. That's and publicizing the work that they do. So that's part of the magazine that I write. So next slide. So first, this slide is kind of, I don't know that it's redundant, but why do people move any building? What we're talking about specifically with the lakeshore and shoreline erosion, lots of times people don't want to tear down their house. Lots of time they want to, in Jane's case, certainly they want to stay on that property. When one of the questions is that Jane brought up is someone asked, wouldn't it just be cheaper to build a new home? Well, certainly right now it would not be cheaper to build a new home. However, people don't consider the environmental cost also of just tearing down a big structure and putting it into landfill, which there is a big environmental cost to that. This is a mitigation tactic. And so one of the reasons to relocate a building just on the mitigation side is that flood mitigation projects, save about $8 to $11 for every dollar spent in disaster recovery costs. So the cost as far as doing something as opposed to doing nothing and waiting for, a house to either be completely flooded poorly or fall into a lake, those are very costly consequences. Next slide. These are just my other things that I talk about in general about why would you move a building. Like in our state, I'm going to give a couple examples, but we're no different than anywhere across the country. We have a severe housing shortage. And so lots of times a home can be relocated and saved. And oftentimes, if they decide to tear down a bunch of buildings, in the case of maybe in flooding instances, and they decide to turn that property to green space, that might be a good choice, but you still don't deal with the housing shortage. You just make it worse. So buildings become certainly more resilient once they are moved. The pictures were showing that new basement being built, that new foundation being built underneath the house that Jane had moved. That certainly makes a building more resilient. And a lot of, depending on the part of the country, they'll be doing other improvements to the property to make it more resilient from the environmental changes that are happening in that area. So those are just some reasons why you might relocate, which I think we're basically talking about shoreline erosion. My next slide is just people talk about what's green, and you know, we can build new greener buildings, that's true, but as opposed to tearing something down and building something new, the greenest building is the one that is already built. So I just like to throw in the environmental stuff because sometimes people don't see that point, that when you're talking about moving buildings. My next slide, I have actually a video, and I don't know if it's going to work. You guys are going to have to try to turn on your end. I'm hoping it does. Before you click into it, if it does work, it's just a minute long, but it shows like a project from start to finish of the equipment going in and a house being elevated.
Tammie, do you want me to try to click on it to see if we can get it there?
Please. Okay.
Ask. Here we go. Is it showing?
I can see it.
Okay.
Looks very familiar.
Oh, I don't think it likes. I'm sorry, I don't think I have access to Vimeo on this.
I feel like you should be okay as a guest, but you know, maybe not.
Forgive me for a moment here. I don't think I'm going to join.
No,
Let me try.
You could just do it as a guest.
Yeah.
Hey,
Sarah?
I've got it available
Okay.
on mine if you want me to share a screen. And
Yeah.
you can rush it back. All right.
Why don't
That's
you
what I was
share
going to
screen?
say.
Thank you.
Okay. Can folks see this?
I feel like this video just answers a
Yes.
few questions. You can actually see the process.
Our clients peace of mind the next time these storms come our way. Home elevation involves lifting a structure built in a central flood hazard area above the base flood elevation. By doing so, all ASCE 24 building codes are adhered to, so the new foundation with the flood vent is built stronger, and the hydrostatic and hydrodynamic forces. Strapping of the house ensures it can withstand hurricane force winds while anchored to the foundation. Landings and stairs are built to ensure our clients can return home after the flood, access their house, preventing further time spent in a shelter or a hotel. All mechanical and electrical systems also elevated out of the flood area. Home elevation is the most viable option for residential flood mitigation.
So thank you guys. That video shows that house was not moving from one location to the other, but basically building, lifting and building moving, it's the same thing. The majority of the work is in the lift process, and so they're simultaneous. They're basically the same process. So I just wanted to show just like a little bit of how a project works. It didn't matter that you didn't hear a lot of that. I think it was okay just so you could kind of see the picture. So the next slide talks about what kind of buildings can you move, and we often will get this. Can you move a slab on grade home? You know, if your house is built on a slab, can you move that? Yes, you can. Often the first floor would be gutted and a new floor installed, but some movers can lift that whole slab up with the house and move that intact. That's very common, like in the South. In the Midwest, they don't do that as much, but it is possible. Can you move certainly anything with a crawl space where it's very easy to get underneath there with your equipment? Split level or attached garage buildings, they can be moved. And some people ask, can you move a building that has masonry on it? So if it's a brick or stone building, can it be moved or lifted? Yes, it can. And it's just, this is one of those things, make sure that you find a mover that is experienced doing that type of move. Basically, when people ask me what can be moved, my answer is pretty much the same. Anything can be moved. The reason why things do not get moved or saved is cost. The scope of the project might feel too large, or there's an impediment in the way of where that building is getting moved. So that's typically why things don't get moved. So next slide. I just put some pictures in here. These are all different types of buildings that were moved. They may have been moved just on their site or farther. If you look at if you count to 4, the 4th building is a completely stone structure. So that's a masonry building. It's a very heavy building. That can be moved just like anything else. The 5th, I saw the arrow, someone helping me with the arrow. The 5th one, the one that, yes, that shows you how much space you need. So they can get in and out in a very small space. Like the Jane's project, it looked like a house mover's dream because she had like this big, huge space on the one side. But it is very common that movers have to get into a very tight space, and they're able to do that typically with the equipment that they have. They're very industrious on moving something slowly if they have to, in just little increments. So the next picture I just put in for kind of amusement on the next slide, that this was on, there was a house moved recently, and they had big things all over the TV station about the road being closed because the house is being moved. So I thought, well, that was very recently, May 24th in Bailey's Harbor. There's been a lot of building moving happening in Door County, some because of flooding, mostly other stuff because of development, but I just put that slide in for fun. The next slide is showing, again, when people say what can be moved, this project is also in Door County, Wisconsin. You can see it was in the winter. It was this winter. This is 4 buildings being moved at once. You can see in the beginning, in the first building is a large barn. The second building is actually a smaller barn. The third building is a duplex, a single-story duplex. The 4th building is a 4-plex. All these buildings were moved in one day, probably about 12 miles, just to give you the possibilities. It's for most jobs, not a barn like that. For a regular job, it typically is about 1 day to 2 days prep, and then the move usually happens in 1 day as well. And the set down doesn't take that long either. So that's just an example of the different types of buildings. And then my next slide, I also put that this is just another building that was lifted recently in Fish Creek, Wisconsin, and got some press. And just it's happened. It's very common that this is happening across the strait. I think a lot of people don't see it because it happens at night or it just kind of blends in, but there's a lot of work going on in our state. The next few slides, again, are just pictures and just to show you the scope of things. This, again, is a good one that shows you how close it is to the shore, how much room a person needs to get in and actually move or lift a building. That particular building was for flood mitigation. The next slide shows a large hotel that was moved. And, you know, after it looks gorgeous and it needed to be moved because of where it was, but they want to keep the building. I like that as an example. My next slide is a historic home that was moved, and it's showing the before and after. And I like to show the after. We don't always get after pictures, but it shows how well it blends in. So next slide. Another example, and you can, this house originally was obviously much lower. And so you can, if you wouldn't have known, you can see, you know, you can see that it was elevated, but I still think it looks gorgeous. This particular home is going to be, it was lifted because of flood issues. Next slide. How do you find a good contractor? So the number one thing you can do, of course, is go on the internet. With us, you can go onto our website, which is ism.org. We have a member directory out there. We have a listing of movers across the country and other countries as well. It's not comprehensive. If you will find movers in Minnesota and in Wisconsin and Michigan, you know, the Midwest that are not part of our association. We're a voluntary joint trade association. So some join it, some don't. What I will say about the people that are in our membership is they are getting ongoing training. So that's one reason that people join our association. And then as finding a contractor, you have to consider, you find the house mover, that's one thing. Depending on the building mover that you hire, it sounds like Jane had a really good experience and they helped with a lot of things, but you have to think about who's going to be the general contractor on that job. when you think about building a house, you have a general contractor. And with house moving, you need a general contractor as well. It typically ends up being the homeowner. So you need to talk about that with your house mover. Are they going to kind of help you through the process so that you'll know how to do those things on your own? That's where that question is. Who will be the general contractor? Next slide. This came up in one of the questions. What is the process? I don't have the cost of all of these things. And actually, if I had the cost for this like 4 months ago, it would be incorrect. But these are basically all the things that you're doing on a project. So you think about the house mover, yes, they're moving the building and they might do some of the things on this list, but many of these things are going to be done by another contractor. This is kind of a comprehensive from the beginning to end. What are the things that have to be done besides moving that building? So I won't go through that, but it starts off with disconnecting, your utilities and any type of site work that you have to do, and then the actual moving of the building and then setting it back on the new foundation. And there's a lot of things involved, just like building a house. You'll have a new foundation, you'll have new walkways, you maybe have new decks, you'll have new stairs in your house. So these are just all of the different things that you'll have in that process. Next slide. Of course, just like anything, you want to find out what type of insurance that the contractor that you hire has. Make sure that you ask for proof of insurance. What they should have is a general liability policy, a cargo or riggers policy that covers the building while it's in transit, and workman's comp policy. The type of insurance is important. Not all building movers have the same thing. Cargo insurance or riggers insurance is actually like I said, the insurance that covers the house when it's lifted in the air, when it's moving from one place to another. Next slide. A biggest thing I think with building moving is finding out a company's work history and asking for their portfolio. And in particular, if you did have a home that had brick or stone on it, or maybe had a chimney, fireplace, you'd want to ask if they had done that type of project before. It's just like vetting out any other contractor that you would hire for any other type of work. Next slide. The building moving or structural moving industry does have a set of standards that they created, I think, about 24 years ago. It's called the Procedural Guidelines for Structural Movers. In that guideline, it goes A to Z, and it is recognized standards of building moving. So there are a few different types of equipment that a mover could use, and basically everything is discussed and recognized in their standards that most building movers are following that standard that was created by the ISM several years ago. Next slide. I just put this in there to remind people to ask if the mover that you hire, ask about their office, because a lot of times these guys are difficult to get a hold of because they run small crews. And so I just recommend asking about, hey, who will I be working with when I need to reach someone? And these are just general contractor questions as well. Next slide. I already talked about this, but one of the reasons why people join our association is to get training. We are basically the only international group that offers training specifically in structural moving or structural lifting. So next slide. This is basically everything I talked about. The one thing that when you're talking about, do you want to save a building or not, you're deciding, is this really right for you? It definitely is a behemoth kind of project. Somebody asked in the beginning, how long do you have to be out of your house? Well, I've seen people be out of their house for probably the shortest time would be approximately 2 months. But I think often a mover would tell someone that they could expect to be out for maybe 4 to 5 months. So just depending on when the project starts, and you have to remember that every building mover is at the mercy of all the other contractors working on the job. So basically none of them are doing their own foundations. So they're waiting for the foundation person to come. They're waiting for the excavator to come. So typically it's not just that the mover can't give you an exact timeline. They're waiting for the other contractors that have to come before them to finish things in the project before they set that house down. In the house that you saw that Jane moved, they moved that building and they built the foundation later once the house was in place. Is that correct, Jane?
Yes.
Yep. So a mover could do it both ways. if the foundation is built first and the building can be moved over the new foundation and set down, that is a much quicker way to do things. So typically the reason why that doesn't happen is people just aren't prepared to have the foundation done first. But buildings can be moved and set either way. They can have the foundation built once it's in place, or the foundation can be built first. And what happens is, if it doesn't seem to make sense, like there's a few beams that are there that would, how do those beams get set? Because they would go into the basement wall. They leave out beam holes for those beams, and then they fill them in later. If it was a poured wall, so like the example that Jane had, that was a block wall. If it was a poured basement wall, they still could leave out pockets for the beam holes, and then they would fill them with that block in the end. So again, this is the final thoughts, is just the basic things, how to find a mover. You can come to our site. Certainly you can Google it. The references I would highlight, and I would highlight just looking at your contract, which you would do with any other contractor that you would hire too. I just want to see if I had another, I think I answered all the questions that I saw through the chat during my presentation. But again, my presentation hopefully gave you a little bit of information, just a general overview. And I just want to tell everybody that's on the webinar that this is a very common process that is literally happening every day, everywhere. And they're all doing it the same way. Some have better, new, improved equipment. Some are using equipment that they had 30 years ago. It still works just as well. It might take a little bit longer, but this is very common. The permitting process is different state to state. In our state, it is very easy to get a building moving permit and to move a building, but again, that is different in every single state. So I'll just be ready for any questions to come to me. I think that's it for my presentation. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Tammie. Yeah, if anybody has any questions for Jane, Tammie, or Dave, now would be a great time to either raise your hand and ask them, or pop those in the chat. I'm not sure we'll have time to revisit Mentimeter, but if you're already logged on there and you want to go ahead and answer the next question, you can. And if we have time, I'll pop those up at the end. But I'm going to prioritize Q&A overall. So if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or pop them in the chat. I see Jared has asked a new question. Are there public resources available to help property owners with the decision-making process regarding moving a structure versus shoreline stabilization? Brochures, cost estimating tools, experts who can be contacted? Any of y'all that have a response to that question can go ahead and ask. And Adam and Kate, I'll ask that you help me if there are any questions we've missed in the chat. But yeah, any responses to that question, Jane, Tammie, or Dave?
From my perspective, we're hearing from people when they've made the decision to move or lift a building. So we wouldn't be on that front end decision making process. So I wouldn't be any help to answer that one.
So I'm not a speaker, but I'll say I put some links in the chat. The Wisconsin Sea Grant published a property owner's guide to protecting your bluff, which we did mention structure relocation as an option in some of those considerations specific to erosion. You know, do you have enough space on your lot to accommodate future erosion, things like that? And of course, linking to Tammie's site for those other, you know, if you need a cost estimate, you can't pull it out of thin air. Tammie, when we first talked, you said talk to a mover. That's every site's different, so that's sort of what we kind of put in there as well, is you know, referencing those organizations that know a lot. But some of those considerations for the specific erosion issue we tried to cover in there.
Any other questions for Dave, Tammie, or Jane?
I just have a comment too, that some of our movers are exclusively doing this work the last 2 years. That is the bulk of their work. Certainly I know of at least 2 movers in Michigan. This is the bulk of their work that they're working on. And sadly, they are usually contacted by homeowners when the building has to be moved within a very, very short period of time. And that is never a good way to enter a project. So I just, as far as the scope of work, there's definitely a lot of work going on in our two, I know in Michigan and Wisconsin, related to this issue of erosion.
I'm going to make a comment to that answer. You know, as a homeowner, it's a daunting task, you know, and we bought this property knowing it had issues. And of course you think, oh, it's never going to happen to us, but it did. And then you have to face the daunting realization of, I have no idea where to begin and what to do, or I don't know anything about this process. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons that they wait. They just don't know. They're afraid. And of course the expense can be daunting, although I think it's less expensive than building new, certainly today.
Adam, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question for Jane about, I think you had covered it, but I maybe didn't quite listen close enough. So you'd mentioned there were some issues with water flowing on the site and how it had been redirected to the ravine off to the side. Had it been, you mentioned some earthwork and things like that. Was that, I guess my understanding was there was some earthwork that sort of directed water right in front of the house that was also accelerating that erosion. Is that correct?
Well, that whole house is surrounded by water flowing because you're on a downhill slope from the highest point. And so we just, a lot of things have been put in place to keep water away from the house before we ever bought it. And we just added on to those things. There were dry streams, rocks, and things like that put into place. And all we wanted to do was keep the foundation from getting wet. And we certainly wanted to keep the water from going over the bluff edge. And those were our goals.
Thanks.
Joanne, I was typing out a response to your question, but I'll go ahead and answer it now. Yes, this recording will be posted to Wisconsin Sea Grant's YouTube channel, and as an attendee of the meeting, you'll receive a recording link for that. So yes. Jared, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I don't know if you're speaking, Jared, but if you are, I can't hear you.
Okay, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, I was on double, triple mute. I was just wondering if the process of approaching, whether you move your house or whether you stabilize your shoreline, and it's, I guess, as was put earlier, it's kind of daunting. People don't know where to start. Does like some sort of community level assessment make sense in any case? Similar to how the National Flood Insurance Program creates flood maps and they tell you, okay, you're in the 100-year flood zone, you're out of the 100-year flood zone. Are there any type of community level assessments that could help people, understand their risk due to bluff erosion, and would something like that make sense? Maybe help people understand on a high level whether or not shoreline stabilization is really feasible based on the shoreline type, bluff height, that kind of thing.
I don't think neighbors or people get that scientifically involved in it unless you have a good scientific background. And I also don't think they realize the amount of water that actually flows across that land at a very slow pace continuously. And they don't notice it until disaster is pending. They don't understand what's going on around them.
Yeah. So I guess the question would be, are there ways that we could proactively communicate that?
Perhaps, that as long as they know where to go to get that information.
Right.
Zoning would be a
Dave?
good place to start, I think.
Dave, maybe you want to talk about the work that you did with Bayfield County years ago?
Well, yeah, I worked with Bayfield County to put in safe setback zones, basically, showing what was our best guess at the necessary setback for a building. And I think we used 50 years or sometimes 75 years as something to measure against. But then Northwest Wisconsin Regional Planning did it for the other counties, and I think maybe redid it for Bayfield as well. And I think that used to be on their website, but I haven't looked at it for quite a while. But I know I worked with them for Douglas and Iron counties. I don't know if any of that has been done for Ashland County.
Seems like that could be useful information for people. But I guess they just need to be made aware that it exists.
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at those websites for probably a couple of years, so I don't know if they're still available on those websites or not. But I think Coastal Management Program funded quite a bit of that, and so I should think one thing could be done is to have Coastal Management say to them, "Hey, are you keeping this up to date on your website?" I don't know if that's possible or not.
Bayfield County still has the information. It has always been hard to find on their website. So if you want to find it for Bayfield County, I'd suggest reaching out to their land information officer. But for Northwest, I'm not sure where that is on their website. I with you, Dave, I haven't looked for quite a long time. And it's advisory. And I think, there are reasons for that. Bayfield County had tried to bring it to become a regulatory, but they had pushback from realtors and other community members. So, there's a push and pull on making something regulatory. But for some counties and some communities, that information's out there. It's not always the easiest to access, but yeah, it's generally advisory as it is.
I guess another related question to anyone on the call is, I think there's some recent research out of Michigan Tech that's predicting lake levels on Lake Superior will rise on average about 8 inches over the next few decades. So the average lake level is expected to go up by that much due to climate change, increased rainfall in the basin. Does anyone have any thoughts on how that kind of affects this topic?
Well, I'll say that I'm convinced that lake level has an influence. And if there's an extended period of time with higher lake level, there will be lots of construction of shore protection structures, presumably. And that will certainly increase the amount of or rate of bluff erosion.
Dave, you've talked about it before in meetings I've been with you, but could you talk a little bit about the erosion and how it affects lower bluffs versus higher bluffs?
Well, I'm hoping that we can see now that the lake level is hopefully going to go down again. We can look at the photos taken at different times and see that. I think the response is faster on low bluffs, but I guess we've never actually tested that. I mean, I think what we need to do is take 50 high bluff profiles and 50 low bluff profiles and see what's happened through this lake level cycle. And that hasn't really been done. But in general, low bluffs react more quickly. Excuse me, I got to continue to that though. But high bluffs with sand and gravel, where there's a lot of accumulation of debris at the bottom during low water, you could see in those photos that I showed that in about 4 years of higher water, all that material at the base is cleaned off. And if it's sand and gravel, you go back to bare sand and gravel slope. So it really depends there on how much erosion takes place. And of course, that varies depending on the orientation of the shoreline and the bathymetry, how quickly it gets deep offshore and so on. So there's a variety of factors that determine how much wave action goes on right at the base, not just lake level.
I guess something else related, I'd asked it in the chat, but it didn't get answered. It's just when people are getting permits to put an armor stone on their shorelines, is there any sort of mechanism to make them need to compensate for the induced erosion to their neighbors or in the system based on just removing that sediment that's in the bluff that would have gone into the beach system, but now it's stuck in the bluff because of the protection? Is there any mechanism to get people to account for that in the permit process or kind of compensate for it? And if not, is that something that people think would be possible in the future as part of a management strategy in Wisconsin?
Well, somebody like Sarah would probably know better than I, but from my experience, people just get a lawyer and sue the neighbor.
I feel like I've seen that idea, if not posed, enacted elsewhere, but not DNR can speak to it, but I don't think that's the case in Wisconsin. But I feel like it's an idea that's out there, and maybe I can look into it, but maybe in place somewhere else, not in Wisconsin.
Well, folks, we are coming up on our time. We're actually over our time by a few minutes. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But I go ahead and pop my email in the chat. And if you have additional questions and you want to email them to me, I can try to funnel them to our speakers today just to keep this conversation going. I know we've had a lot of good questions, and sorry we didn't get to revisit Mentimeter today, but I'm really happy that we had so many great questions. So I want to thank all of today's speakers, Tammie, Jane, and Dave. Thank you so much for your expertise and your knowledge and your stories that you share with us today. And thank you, members, for attending today's CHAOSS meeting. We hope to see you at our next quarterly CHAOSS meeting that will be in probably September or October. So thank you all so much, and I'll adjourn the meeting here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.